Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Happy Friday, everyone. This is Marty Kaiser with our Friday edition of Real Estate Tidbits. Hope everyone's doing well and looking forward to a fun weekend. We're still fighting against this crazy heat, and not only in Florida but across the country. So as I keep mentioning, make sure you guys stay hydrated. For those of us that are out in the sun, whether it's running, walking, whatever the case, make sure you use plenty of sunblock because you don't want to have skin problems in the future. So anyway, I thought today we've kind of had some informational along with a rant podcast the last few. So I hadn't done any sports for a while, so I'm going to start this off with a little bit of sports, and then we'll kind of pivot to some other issues. So sports-wise, what you may have noticed is the NFL football season is almost upon us. They actually, believe it or not, had their first exhibition game last night, and they're having their Hall of Fame inductions tomorrow in Canton, Ohio. So for people that are historical fans of football and like to watch their favorite players, I think they're inducting 3 or 4 players into the Hall of Fame tomorrow. The regular season, and I don't have my calendar in front of me, but I'm going to say it'll start sometime after Labor Day. So it's not too far away. We're about 4 to 5 weeks away from the start of the regular season. And the NFL, as always, is by far the most popular sport. On a personal level, I play fantasy football. Some people might think that's a juvenile game, but it's very popular across the country. And so fantasy football is a lot of fun, and it's kind of harmless fun. Some people have some financial incentives, but for the most part, the leagues are pretty painless and very little money's involved. So every year when you're in fantasy, you hold an annual draft, and basically everybody, it kind of simulates what the NFL draft would be in terms of you have a first round, second round, etc. We actually have 15 rounds in the fantasy draft, so it takes a good afternoon. And the only thing different from our draft versus like real life is we go in what they call snake order. So the team that drafts first in the first round drafts last in the second round, and then they draft first in the third round. So you alternate. The front of the order drafts first in the odd number draft rounds, and the team or person that drafts last in the first round drafts first in the second round. So they draft first in the even numbered things. That's to make it fair so that one team's not getting the preferred spot in every round. So anyway, that's a little bit about football. Now baseball, for those of you that are Major League Baseball fans, we're kind of in the height of the pennant race. After the All-Star game, it starts to get more serious. We're about at the 2/3 point of the regular season. The regular season in baseball ends around the end of September, first week of October, and then they go into the different playoffs. So what happened this past week, which just concluded yesterday rather, Thursday at 6 p.m., is they have the trade deadline. So a lot of the teams in baseball they wheel and deal and make all these trades to try to, the teams that are in contention try to acquire players to fill in weak spots. The teams that are out of contention and that are having kind of a below average year, a lot of times they'll trade off some of their players, especially if they want to cut payroll or maybe get rid of their older players. And they trade those for what we refer to in baseball as prospects. Younger players that may just have started the major leagues or still could be in the minor leagues, but have a lot of potential according to their rating. So the theory behind that from the poor teams is they want to rebuild their team with a lot of young talent, and then it also saves them money because when they're the young players, they make a lot less than the established veteran players. And one thing you find in sports nowadays, which a lot of people don't like, It's all about money. And of course, the top players make a ton of money. But at the same time, all these owners ultimately make a ton of money, and I mean a ton of money. They'll use creative bookkeeping, and they may complain that their P&L statements in a given year, they lose money. But they have a lot of fancy accounting techniques to do depreciation and other creative things, so it makes their balance sheet look a lot more negative each year. But at the end of the day, when these teams are sold, they make a fortune. For example, the most recent sale in another sport was the Los Angeles Lakers in basketball. And they sold, if you can believe it, for $10 billion. That's right, $10 billion. And they were purchased by the ownership that just sold it. I believe they purchased the team somewhere around 45 years ago, give or take. And at that time, they probably paid, and I don't know the exact, I don't have notes in front of me, but they probably paid, $50 or $100 million, something like that. So in 40 years, the value of that team has compounded 1,000-fold or more. So that's not too shabby a return on investment. So don't ever believe, no matter how much these owners cry, that they're not making a fortune. And keep in mind, they're already extremely wealthy before they buy a sports team. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bought one. And some of these sports are very cutthroat. The sport with the biggest disparity in terms of treatment of players versus owners is the NFL and football. And for those of us that are fans, we know that you'll hear about contracts, and it might say player X got a 4-year contract, and he's going to be paid, let's say, $60 million. So we're thinking, boy, that's $15 million a year. But then you read the fine points of the contract, and out of that $60 million, maybe $30 million is guaranteed, and usually that $30 million is spread out over the first year or two. And then if they, for whatever reason, have a change of heart, they don't like the player anymore, their team is deteriorated, whatever the reason is, they can actually release that player and not pay him another nickel. But on the flip side, that player signed a 4-year contract. So let's say we go the other way. The player went from being a very good player to being by far the best player in his position. So he says, hey, guys, I got 2 more years left on my contract, and I'm severely underpaid because I'm only making $15 million a year, and players with comparable skills to me are making $30 to $40 million a year. So the team can legally say, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles. You're under contract with us, so we choose not to pay you more. So basically in football, they sign unilateral contracts. And what does that mean? Well, that means that one side of the contract has to follow it for the term if they can't agree on a compromise, where the other side of the contract can outright cancel the contract in midstream, and there's no recourse for the other party. So let's correlate that to real estate, just to give you an idea how sports vary so much from real life. Let's say you're selling a really expensive house in real estate. So let's say you're selling a house for $5 million, and you've got the closing set up for 45 days. So the buyer goes through the inspections and approves the inspection. And let's furthermore, to make this illustration simpler, that it's a cash transaction. So basically the only contingency was the inspection, and now the inspection's been satisfied. So now from the seller's standpoint, it's just a question of waiting for closing so they can transfer ownership to the new buyer and reap their proceeds. Well, let's further say that particular buyer who planned on buying a $5 million house, let's just say in Winter Park, all of a sudden 2 weeks before closing decides, well, I'm overpaying for this $5 million house. I just saw they came on the market, a nicer house, a newer house, and it's in Windermere, and it's only going for $4,250,000. So I'm going to not buy the $5 million house, and I'm going to buy the $4,250,000 house. So they notify the seller of the $5 million house that they're canceling the contract. They're doing it what's called unilaterally. Well, the contracts have recourse in terms about that. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but to kind of simplify how a contract is written, the buyer puts down an earnest money deposit. So maybe on a $5 million contract, and this depends on what the seller demands, but let's just say for discussion purposes, they put $50,000 in escrow. So they have a third party, which is typically a title company or a lawyer, that maintains that escrow until closing. So now the seller gets notified that that deal is getting canceled. And of course, you can imagine how a seller would react, not pleasantly, to be polite about it. So now the seller consults with their attorney. And again, I'm simplifying this. Maybe an attorney will have more creative recommendations, but the way that a typical contract reads, it says the seller can claim the deposit as liquidated damages. So basically, if the seller gets a deposit, for the most part, they're constrained from pursuing further legal action against them. Now, to get the deposit, you still have to go through a procedure. And if the buyer doesn't want to relinquish the deposit, then you have other legal issues that come into the forefront. But let's say the seller says, well, $50,000, that's nothing. This is a $5 million sale. I've made a lot of elaborate plans. I'm 90% ready to move. I've picked out another expensive property that I was planning on using part of these proceeds to help buy that property. And so the seller consults his attorney and says, let's sue the buyer for specific performance. And that means that they're suing to enforce the contract. So without me giving a legal opinion, obviously the facts I've laid out to you, you would think that the buyer would lose that litigation. But the question is, how long does that litigation take? It's going to take a while because our legal system is always backed up. And it's not a murder case or a predator case, something that gets a lot of publicity. It's just a business transaction that went south. So the seller has to go through the legal process and wait until it comes to court and then wait for the decision. And of course, then theoretically, the buyer could appeal that. So the point of me giving you these different analogies are sports, especially the NFL, is an entity to itself. And the things that they're able to get away with in football from the ownership standpoint could not be duplicated in real life. But anyway, hopefully somebody will find that interesting. And as you know from listening to me, I do follow sports and enjoy chatting about it. I'm probably a frustrated sports talk show host, but I enjoy real estate quite a bit too. So that's it for sports today. To go into real estate, a couple pieces of news that you may have heard about. The Federal Reserve just had a meeting a few days ago, and they've decided to hold rates where they were. So I think some people were hoping that the rates would go down, but I think the holding of the rates was pretty much expected. However, what was kind of unique about it was that the Federal Reserve is a 12-person board. And usually when they have these Federal Reserve meetings, they're unanimous in their thinking about what direction they're going to go with these different interest rates and such. This particular case, the vote was 10-2 to keep the interest rates where they are. But what was unique is you had two people that wanted to lower the interest rates. And that, to my knowledge, has not happened, or if it has, it's been years and years before they've had dissent in the Federal Reserve. What also got publicity is that I think it was last week, Donald Trump met with the Federal Reserve head and in his unique, inimitable way, has criticized the Federal Reserve head, has threatened to terminate him, and has put pressure on him to lower the interest rates. But so far, the Federal Reserve has held strong. The thing that is, whether you think the interest rates should go down or not, that's not really the issue. The issue is that the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and unfortunately, our current president, as is evidenced by many of the things he does, has no respect for the rule of law. He kind of feels that whether you agree with his points of view or not, he's an entity upon himself, and he can arbitrarily make legal changes. And they've tried to circumvent the law in some of the things. Like, I know everybody's read about some of the unusual things that ICE is doing in terms of not giving due process to certain people they're deporting, and just other things. But a democracy is only as good as not only following the rules of law, but that the people following them. And I think what's concerning to a certain percentage of our population is that we're concerned that we're headed down the path of dictatorship or authoritarianism. Because if the person that's your number one decision maker, which in our case is the president, doesn't feel he has to follow legal precedents and can institute his own legal system, that's pretty scary. And, I can't say anything more or less about that, in that it's something that gravely disturbs me. And it has nothing to do with politics. I'd say the same thing if an independent was president, if a Democrat was president, or in this case, if a Republican is president. Another thing that's gotten a lot on the news while we're speaking of political things is the Epstein situation with the list, and the government kind of saying one thing and then saying they don't have a list. And there's just been a lot of irregularities. I think most people with common sense that don't have a political interest feel that there is a list that's being covered up. And why would it be covering up? Because there's some probably very important people on that list that would suffer at the least grave embarrassment, at the most some different legal or financial ramifications that could ensue. I mean, think about it. You have a wealthy, immoral predator who has an island of all these young, attractive women. All that's been verified, and he finally got prosecuted after years of doing that. And it's been pretty evident from what you hear that there's been a lot of men that have visited that island. Well, think about it. A wealthy, middle-aged white man that has an island of young women, what type of people is he going to invite to that island? Powerful people, rich people, and probably people that he has more in common with, in addition to them being powerful and rich, meaning that they're probably, in a lot of cases, middle-aged white men. Because people in life tend to associate with people of similar interests and values. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to speculate on what kind of individuals have been visiting that island. And so when you talk about rich, powerful, middle-aged white men, what do you think about? People of importance in corporations, people in powerful positions in our political system. So you can imagine that there's a lot of people that don't want this information to come out. Whether it ever comes out or not, we'll see. But it's really disgusting, and in our country, there's two types of justice, and the rich and powerful can pretty much buy their way out of a lot of situations. And then you couple that with the recent tax cuts that we had, which are benefiting greatly the wealthiest people in our country. And then the people that need assistance, in many cases, they're getting benefits taken away from them. There's just something that's just so irregular about that. And again, people will say, well, you're just a bleeding heart liberal. Or I'm not a liberal at all. I'm a pragmatist that looks at fairness and equity. And our country has deviated from that. We're just not equitable anymore. We've had a separation of the haves and the have-nots, and it's been exacerbated tremendously the last 35 years. And it's not a Republican or a Democratic problem. It's a political problem, because regardless of who's been in office, they've enabled these disparities to continue and get larger. And it just makes for a lot of discord in our country. And those are things that I think, I guess the average citizen kind of shrugs their shoulders and says, well, my lifestyle is good. I'm only one person. I can't do anything about it. So people kind of move on about their daily business and figure, there's nothing they can do about it. That's not their problem. But what ends up happening when people are indifferent or just feel that they're powerless is that these things exacerbate, because the people in power know that the people not in power are not going to make much of an issue about a lot of these things. And over time, they just get worse and worse. So it's really sad. Just like with the climate, we've got these record heat waves in many states in the country. We've had these flash floods and fatalities. We almost had we had tsunami warnings in California. We get these multiple environmental extreme weather things that are happening more and more each year. They have to be attributed to something. And for people to say, oh, it's not environmental, it's just cyclical, that's just burying your head in the sand. And the longer that we go without doing anything about these things, the worse things are going to be for every citizen, regardless of how much money you have. Unless you build a completely steel-caged bomb shelter, basically, you're going to be vulnerable as well. And, it's frustrating because, again, you don't have to be a PhD to see all the things that are happening. Last but not least, real estate's been in the news a little bit lately. Depending on what part of the country that you live in and what your viewpoints are, they've been continuing publicity on the state of posting listings as soon as you get them. Compass Realty, as I've mentioned in previous shows, is of the belief that you should be able to have a private database and you shouldn't have to publicize listings for sales. And that's pretty much contrary to most of the National Association of Realtors policies. So that issue is getting continued publicity. Right now, the status quo is pretty much holding, but you never know. Things could change somewhat. And again, everybody has their own opinion about that. My own opinion is, I feel in almost every case, the more competition you have to buy and sell properties, the better it is for all concerned. So I don't feel personally that a private network excluding properties from being exposed to the widest variety of people is a good thing for the real estate industry, or is a good thing for the sellers, or a good thing for the buyers. I think that the negatives of that way surpass the positives of that. But that's just one person's opinion. Last but not least, everybody's really hoping for these interest rates to take place at the next Fed's meeting. The market itself is definitely still in that transition period where it's giving buyers a lot more leverage in negotiations. You're definitely seeing more price adjustments. A lot more properties are sitting. The time on the market on unsold properties is increasing. So one of the things that I spend the most time on right now is not only having a computer, so to speak, to house all the information that I'm sharing with you and keep it up on all the properties, but when I do talk to current or future sellers, explaining to them if the timing is such that you want to sell your property in the near future, you really need to pay attention to these pricing trends. Because what frequently happens is people choose to be a little bit more stubborn, and they think that we're in a market that we were in a couple years ago. So they place their property on the market at the high price that wasn't recommended. And the property doesn't sell. And then they either do one of two things typically. They'll either ultimately fire their realtor because they say, well, the property didn't sell, the realtor didn't do an effective job. Or they'll go through a series of price adjustments until they get to that sweet spot that ends up selling the property. But when you go through those price adjustments downward, you're never really staying ahead of the trends. So you're always trying to play catch up, which is never a good thing in real estate. And ultimately, I can show you case after case where people that employ that strategy and ultimately sell their house, they end up selling their house for less than they would have sold it had they priced it properly to begin with. But, people are stubborn. There's definitely a percentage of realtors that are either new in the business, they're not confident enough to give sellers this factual information because they either feel that the sellers won't accept it positively and they won't hire that agent, or they just want to pacify the seller and put the house on the price that the seller requests. And then they'll continually go back to the seller to try to reduce the price. But in my opinion, they're not doing their most in a fiduciary capacity by handling pricing in that way. But that's me. I'm more of I'll tell you like I think it is. I have facts to back it up. I think my track record reflects that I'm usually right a lot more than I'm wrong. And I'm sure there's a minority of customers that don't appreciate my factual kind of like blunt nature. But I'd rather not do business with a customer than tell them things that I know are not true. So anyway, that's all for today. I hope everyone's having a great day. Again, stay hydrated this weekend. And this is Marty Kaiser out.